Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Michael Osman. Today is part 2 of the How to Film Your Hunt Like a Pro series. I'm going to go over 3 things that I use the most on my camera to make sure I get the best possible footage I can get at all times. Let's dive in. Alright, the first thing I want to talk about is manual focus. You know, all these cameras have a lot of focus systems. Autofocus has obviously come a long ways and is a lot better than it used to be, and you can use autofocus in a lot of situations. But when I'm filming my hunts, I always shoot in manual focus. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I don't want my focus to get stolen by something that comes into the frame. You know, anytime a twig or a branch comes into your frame, it can steal your autofocus and completely blur out your subject. So, you know, when you have that deer coming in, you're getting ready to take a shot and you're moving the camera into position, and all of a sudden a twig steals that focus and now your deer or whatever animal it is completely blurred out. I don't want to risk that situation. So I always use manual focus when I'm shooting my hunts. One thing that really helps when shooting manual focus too is focus peaking. Most cameras will have it and you can turn it on. You just got to find it where it's at in your camera. And what focus peaking does is basically will outline your subject. Whatever is in focus, it will outline it in a color for you. So I always have it set for red is what I have it set on mine. And so if it's in focus, it will be outlined in red. And so that way it helps you know when you're in focus, especially if you're just using like the small screen on your camera, you know, the little 2-inch LCD screen. That way you can tell when it's in focus and when it's out of focus. Otherwise, if you're using like an external monitor, it's a lot easier to see if it's in focus if it's a bigger monitor and you can actually see it a lot better. But generally, I always use the manual focus when I'm in my hunts. I still use autofocus in different times. Like right now I'm using autofocus because I'm in a controlled environment. And when I'm doing like my interviews in the tree stand or where I'm at, I'll use autofocus a lot. But also there's times where, you know, autofocus will struggle, especially in like low light situations. I don't know if you've ever tried it or not or noticed it, but when the light is super low, autofocus, it really starts searching a lot because there's not enough light, so it can't tell what's in the frame, you know, what it's trying to, you know, lock onto. And so like I'll use manual focus even when I'm shooting like a end of the night interview or an early morning interview if it's super dark. But otherwise I'll use autofocus when I shoot most of my interviews in the tree stand or wherever I'm at. But manual focus is definitely a lot less risky because you can know exactly what's in focus at all times. And that makes a big difference. And I always try and make sure I know what's in focus because I don't want to lose any of those, you know, situations where I have that opportunity to get a good shot on, you know, on camera. And I don't want to have autofocus be the risk that I could lose that shot. So manual focus is a really good thing to learn. And a lot of cameras nowadays, you can get remotes where you can actually control the manual focus from the remote. And so that makes a big difference. So I would highly recommend using manual focus if you can. If you've never used it or you know you are unsure, just practice with it and turn on that focus peaking. And once you get it figured out, it will make a huge difference in your hunts. And you'll definitely enjoy getting that good crisp footage all the time with manual focus. The next thing I want to talk about are ND filters or neutral density filters. And basically what they are is they're sunglasses for your camera. So basically what they do is you put this on the end of your lens and it's gonna darken everything. So that way you can keep your aperture lower. So that way you don't have to crank your aperture all the way up and you can keep that shallow depth of field even when it's super bright out. This filter here is actually a variable ND filter, which I highly recommend because then you don't have to put on a different ND filter all the time. This one you can actually darken by just twisting it. So if it's super bright outside, you can have it at the darker setting. If it's not super dark, you can open it back up and it won't be as dark. ND filters are such a huge advantage that you can use because you can put this on and then you can adjust this to adjust your exposure. So when it's super bright out, you have that really dark setting all the way closed. And then if it's not super bright, you can open it up and then you can adjust that exposure, which is just so nice to have. You're not having to make adjustments on your camera. Instead, you're just making adjustments using your ND filter. I use this all the time. I never go hunting without it because you just never know when you're gonna need it. ND filters are one of the best things you can use when you're out filming your hunts to get great, good, clear footage. There are certain cameras, especially like cinema cameras, that have ND filters built in, which would be super nice, but the majority of cameras don't have them built in. So you can actually buy one filter, depending on if you have multiple lenses for your camera, get the biggest one, the biggest ND filter that you can buy, which is going to be like 82 millimeters or something like that. And then you can actually get step-up rings. So if you're trying to slap it onto a smaller lens, you can put the step-up ring on and then just put the one bigger ND filter on. So I highly recommend ND filters. It will make a huge difference in making sure that your footage is going to be good all the time. You can always keep your footage properly exposed and get the best footage that you can get for your hunt. Here's some example footage that I took with ND filters and without an ND filter. All right, so the final thing I want to talk about today is a histogram and why you should be using it when you're filming your hunts. So a histogram is going to be one of the best tools you can use to make sure your footage is properly exposed, because it's going to tell you whether you're underexposed or overexposed. Basically, the left side of your histogram is what covers the shadows of the image. So it's going to tell you if you have too much shadows, if it's too underexposed. The right side of the histogram is going to be your highlights, and so it's going to tell you whether it's too overexposed. And then the middle is going to be your midtones. So basically your goal when using a histogram is to try and get as even of a level as you can throughout the histogram without too much peaking on either side. So you'll notice if you get too far, if you have too many shadows, if it's just too dark, you'll see where the lines will start to peak. They'll go straight up and go to the top of the image. And that just means you're underexposed and you won't be able to recover those shadows. That's not always a bad thing if it's just a little bit, but you definitely want to make sure you're not completely underexposed. And it's the same with the highlights. If you go too far with the highlights, if it's really bright out and they're completely blown out and they're peaking on that right side of that histogram, you're not going to be able to completely recover those highlights. And so you want to make sure that you don't peak on either side and try and get as even of a line as you can across the histogram. Sometimes it's going to be hard to do, especially when it's really sunny outside. That's why I do recommend the ND filters, because that makes a big difference on being able to keep those from peaking too much. Another thing you can do is you can shoot in a flat profile like a log, but that's another thing that we'd have to get into that's a lot more difficult, because now you're shooting basically a straight gray profile, and then you're going to have to go back and color correct and color grade your image. It adds a lot of work. And that's something that you're gonna have to practice a lot with editing. It takes a lot of time to get that worked out properly. But histograms are just such a great tool to use, because you can always make sure that your footage is exposed properly when you're out hunting. Instead of just looking at the image on your screen, you're able to just look at the histogram and just follow what the histogram says. That's what I do all the time. Most of the time, I'm always just going straight off my histogram. That way I know I don't have anything too blown out with my highlights, or I don't have anything too underexposed in my shadows. So you're able to keep that nice even line across the whole middle of it. So here are some examples using a histogram that'll show you whether you're underexposed or overexposed. So in this image, you can see that we're underexposed here. We don't have any of the highlights and hardly any midtones as well. Everything is all on the shadows, so it means we're underexposed. So that just means we need to either up our ISO or open our aperture back up and try and get those highlights and those midtones back in the image. So here you can see our image is overexposed. We don't have anything in the shadows of the histogram, and over in the highlights on the right side, we're peaking. The lines peak to the top of the screen of the histogram, so that means we're blowing out our highlights, and we won't be able to fully recover that when we go into editing. You can adjust it some, but if it's fully blown out like that, if it's peaked on the highlights or the shadows, it's something that you will not be able to absolutely correct when you're editing your footage. Another thing that you could pay attention to is the metering mode, and you'll see where it says 0.0, and that means that you're properly exposed based off what the camera believes. So if it's at 0.0, you're exposed. If it goes plus, that means you're getting overexposed. If it goes minus, you're getting underexposed. And you can be, a little off from 0.0. You can be 0.3 or 0.7, but your goal is to try and keep it at 0.0, because that means that you're properly exposed. So that's another way you can help check to make sure you're exposed with using your histogram and the metering mode. Well, that's going to conclude part 2 of the How to Film Your Hunt Like a Pro series. I hope you got some useful information from this video and learned a few things. In the next video, I'm going to be going over how I do my edits, and I'm going to be going over some simple tips that you can do to adjust your footage to make sure it's the best possible footage you can get for your videos. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down below and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Hit that subscribe button and hit that bell if you want to be notified when the next video drops. Thanks for watching. Until next time.